Hello, good evening, and welcome to the CAD platform. Welcome to our first webinar for the year. Before I get started, let me introduce myself. I am Kavita Pipalia. I am the president of the California Association of the Deaf. I wish you a happy new year, and we bring you more positive energy this year and moving forward. We'll begin tonight's webinar with some house rules. We will have a speaker present for about 20 to 30 minutes. You will also have an opportunity to type in a question within the chat box to ask the speaker a question about the presentation. You can also ask a question on the YouTube channel if that is where you're watching. You can ask in either platform, and I will go ahead and forward your question to our speaker tonight. Secondly, please avoid foul language. We will ask you to leave if you use foul language. Third, if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, feel free to type that out in the chat box on Facebook or the chat box on YouTube. With the health rules out of the way, I'm excited to tell you our title for tonight. Tonight's presentation is titled Language Begins at Birth: How It Impacts Deaf People's Lives. That topic will be presented by Dr. Marla Hatrack, which is on the screen now. Welcome, Dr. Hatrack. So good to see you. And this is Dr. Marla Hatrack speaking. Thank you, Kavita. Kavita asks, how are you doing? This is Dr. Marla. I am a little bit nervous tonight, so I'll do my best to slow down my signing. And thank you for such a warm introduction. This is Kavita speaking. Okay, we will begin tonight's presentation. Dr. Hatrack speaking. I work at the University of California in San Diego within the linguistics department. They have a flyer there. One of our faculty members presented, and I don't remember the topic, but this faculty member was mentioning that language is something that we use without realizing it. We use it every day. We speak from sunrise to sunset, day in, day out. And we just don't think about it. This speaker said people use language, as a given, as if it's just a part of who we are. But then looking at deaf individuals, they have unique language needs. And I'm going to go ahead and try to cover that within 20 to 30 minutes. So I'll do my best. Now, we won't get in depth. However, we will touch upon many areas that we can definitely have dialogue and connect it to the title of tonight's presentation. I'd like to outline the points in tonight's presentation. We'll start with talking about the reason and purpose for this presentation, and then I will cover the importance of language acquisition and development. Now, some of you might be familiar with this, and I might be preaching to the choir, but I want the dialogue to continue with these themes in mind until we solve language deprivation syndromes. The next thing we'll cover tonight is the importance of advocating policy changes and structures system-wide in all systems, private, public, and we should have those conversations. We will also talk about proposing solutions to perhaps not reach the ideal, but to advocate for language acquisition for deaf babies. Now, I noticed we don't invest too much in problem solving. When one thinks about businesses and organizations, and when there's an issue within those entities, they invest in problem solving. They figure out what the issue is, how the issue can be solved, why the issue came up, who's involved with the issue, when the issue occurs, where the issue occurs. And as I was preparing my PowerPoint for tonight, I had to turn it in on Monday. I had some thoughts occur during the week, and I realized, oh boy, I'm stuck with this PowerPoint. However, in looking at this slide, I realized that we already have the solution. We already know the answers. We already know how things have happened. We already know the what, the why, the when, the who, the where. We all already know that. However, language deprivation syndrome continues to be perpetuated. I'm going to check in as I present tonight with the interpreter because we are working together as a team just to make sure that the interpreter is keeping up with my presentation. Allow me to continue. I Googled problem-solving graphics and I selected the most colorful one out of a whole array of choices of graphics. There are various visual representations to solving issues, and I'm just going to use this one. First, one needs to identify the problem and set up objectives based off that data. Once that's done, one needs to analyze the problem to determine its cause. Third, we need to begin generating alternative solutions. Fourth, there must be an evaluation and a selection of the most suitable solution, the best fit for the current need, the best fit for the community and the culture. Number 5, then an implementation of those decisions must be done. Number 6, follow-up and evaluation of results must also be performed. Interestingly enough, when I see this infographic, I look back and think of when in California, right after AB 272 was turned down in 2019, we invited stakeholders from different organizations to come together to have a conversation about a proposal that we would like to make. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of conversation at that time. Some of the members were concerned about K through 12 education. Other stakeholders or other members of the community had concerns about interpreting. And then there were other members who had concerns about birth to 3 years of age. And I was one of those voices sharing input. I mentioned that there's a lot of failure in the K through 12 system because there's not enough language development from birth to 3. And there's a whole list of reasons, lack of exposure, so on and so on. All those causes have been identified already. We submitted Bill 210, SB 210, and it passed unanimously. 100% consensus in both the House, not the House, I'm sorry, in the Assembly and in the state of California. Unanimous pass, not one objection. That was a powerful day for deaf people in the state of California. And again, that was in 2015. Moving forward to 2023, there hasn't been much of a shakeup in politics on a national level, so it is a little bit concerning. I would like for us to also have a conversation about that. We've made progress. We've set up deaf coaches. We've set up Lead K Family Services. We've received federal grants, and we are making progress, and the momentum is there. In my perspective, the momentum is moving too slowly. As long as we don't mobilize deaf children, they will continue to grow up with impoverished language skills and suffer academically in K through 12, suffer in literacy skills, and so on and so on. So with that said, next slide. When I looked around, I was surprised to see this slide. There are more barriers to problem solving than anything else. In my dissertation in February of 2022, this came up as well. However, I hadn't realized how prevalent it was amongst people, and that we should know and be familiar that the barriers exist and that we have the ability to mobilize in support of language acquisition for deaf children. Now, I'm not familiar with all the barriers in depth enough to have a deeper conversation about it. However, I do recognize and acknowledge that the barriers exist, and it means that as a community, we need to come together. We need to evaluate and self-assess if we ourselves are a barrier towards moving towards improved language acquisition. That could be the case. Are we vicariously taking on other barriers and then making ourselves feel that we can't do anything about the issue? And this is probably a conversation for another day, a rainy day, perhaps. Moving forward. I remember when I first got involved in being an activist slash advocate for language acquisition in deaf children. Quite often, deaf people themselves, yes, give me just a second. Someone trying to get my attention. I'm not sure what you want me to see. Excuse me. Often I would advocate for language acquisition, and deaf people would reach out to me, and this is about 2012, and ask me if I was aware how important cochlear implants are. But I don't see the connection between language acquisition and cochlear implants. There really is no nexus there. I was thrown off that I was being asked about cochlear implants. And I realized that at the time that I got involved in advocacy and activism, I hadn't really understood the impacts. Well, people hadn't really understood the impacts of language deprivation. However, thanks to research projects and publications of articles, that has helped us have a better and deeper understanding of language deprivation. We now have the right kind of data that can be used to file lawsuits, although that hasn't happened yet, which is also interesting. There are a lot of actions that we should have taken already that haven't been taken yet. Are there reasons? Are there explanations for it? Whether you agree with me or agree with those explanations, it's a dialogue that I want us to have. I want us to talk about why we, as deaf individuals, as a group of deaf professionals, as a group of deaf business owners, as a group of deaf volunteers, we should all be more concerned with this issue than we have been. Because the deaf community, seeing deaf businesses thrive, seeing deaf professionals and more deaf PhDs and doctors is impressive. However, that means the chasm grows. That means language deprivation becomes a much more serious issue and more children are left behind. That is exactly the issue we are talking about tonight. How do we have deaf children be more kindergarten ready? Language deprivation is not something we can extinguish, but it is something that we can reduce. There are choices. A lot of times, deaf parents will say, well, those parents, it was their choice. Parents made the choice. And as a parent, if somebody were to try to warn me of a danger, I would listen. But some of those parents really aren't taking in the warning. Maybe because deaf people themselves are also creating a barrier by saying we've got to respect parent choice. That concerns me. And this is just an example. There are more responses to this issue, and a lot of that might be internalized autism. And okay, let me check in with the interpreter. Okay, we're caught up. Now, most of us are aware of these points on the slide here about language acquisition, but let's remind ourselves why we should have an increased concern about this issue. Interpreters, of course. K through 12, of course. Post-secondary education, of course, of course. All of those are areas where the issue and the problems can be reduced if we invest in children that are birthed to age 3. My family and I were having a conversation about this issue last night, and they made some points that I had never thought of. They said, right, if a deaf baby is born to 3 years old and the parents are hearing, those parents are busy with life and work and they can't be involved. That is another issue that was brought up last night from my family that made me ask myself, how can we better collaborate at the local, state, and federal level in order to work towards solving this issue? Now, I do want us to focus on deaf children. However, what I'm saying, the message I'm sharing applies to all children worldwide, hearing or deaf. But for this evening and this presentation, we're focused on deaf children. Keep that in mind. Deaf children must acquire a complete language within a certain time frame or window. If that window is 0 or birth to 3 or birth to 4 years old, that window is birth to 3, birth to 4. If it is missed, then there are impacts to language acquisition in deaf children. Again, from birth to 3 is a critical time period. If you go to Google and do a search, there are language milestones that you can easily find. Deaf children develop along the same schedule that hearing children develop using ASL. They do, and we need to promote language milestones. CDE has the statistics on their website. They have the milestones on their website, excuse the interpreter, showing those development markers. Like, for example, by age 4, a child should ask a couple WH questions like why, who, how. And many deaf children can't do that or don't do that. Why are we complacent about this issue when we see that? Now, I've mentioned language a lot, but an offshoot from language is social development. That cannot be separated from language. Cognitive development also is included. You can see the Venn diagram on the slide. Language, social, emotional, and cognitive development cannot be separated. They develop together on a continuum. So let's say a deaf child is upset, but they lack the language to explain why they're upset. That means that their social emotional level is stunted. So we need to think critically about those impacts and try to be more invested in the movement to change the system. More and more papers now show that the brain's architecture is altered when there is no data input to the brain. We don't have data on deaf children, but we have tested deaf adults and deaf people with language deprivation. Now, not all deaf people experience language deprivation. There are some people that have experienced language deprivation that are deaf, and in scans, they have found that their brains are altered. Their brains continue to work, just in a different way. The ultimate impacts are the K through 12 and academic impacts. As we know, in the K through 12 setting, we hear the same thing. Oh, deaf children read at 3rd grade level, and so on and so on and so on. We've already identified the issue. We've already identified the solution. We have everything completely laid out. The only thing we haven't done is mobilized and taken action. So I ask you tonight, what does it take? Kavita, I'd like your input when we are done tonight on your perspective on that. And this conversation isn't limited to tonight, but I must say, even with language acquisition, even with a deaf child being kindergarten ready, about 8th or ninth grade, they should develop good reading skills and have critical thinking skills where they can do analysis. Now, I'd like to ask you, those critical thinking skills, could they be hindering us? It's possible. It's possible. Let me check in with the interpreter. Now, I will admit that I've been familiar, heard of the term cognition, and that was the third circle in the Venn diagram that I just showed you. I had seen the term many times, but I was dumbfounded at what it actually means. If you don't have language skills, that means you will lack these other areas. Those areas are in those 6 bubbles on the screen. Perception, perceiving. You'll lack in reasoning. We use reasoning to come to agreements. We use reasoning to talk with our friends, make decisions. What else? Evaluation, judging, learning, remembering. When I saw that, I realized it's a small part of cognitive development. There is executive function to also think about. We have to understand that completely before we advocate for language acquisition for all deaf children. We should be way more concerned at the moment if it means that the deaf community overall in general lacks these skills because of language acquisition issues. Okay, just checking with the interpreter as I do the slide change. Now, some of us are familiar, some of us are not familiar. However, there's a well-known uh, pyramid called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You can see that there. At the very bottom, you see Peterson and Rems-Samario, excuse the interpreter, Peterson and Rems-Samario asked the question, did Maslow forget language on the bottom? Did Maslow forget language? Because as hearing people take speech for granted, the psychological needs is where language should be included, but it's taken for granted. We see food, water, warmth in there, if you can see it. And then the needs that move up from there are safety, security, then belonging, love, like romantic relationships or friends. And then as one develops, one moves on to esteem needs like prestige, self-esteem, feeling accomplished. And then at the very top of the hierarchy of needs pyramid is self-actualization, where a person actuates and becomes their own person. You can't reach the very top of this pyramid without language acquisition, without developing cognition. So if you think about those other levels, there's no question that families of deaf love them. But without language, they can't reach the pinnacle of that pyramid. We don't really know enough about this, but it's obvious. This pyramid lacks the language component at that bottom level of psychological needs. It needs to be added there. Next slide. Now, in talking about K through 12 and academic achievement of deaf students, I'd like to ask, what do we know about their K through 12 achievements? In the state of California in 2009, there was a legislative mandate to disaggregate deaf student scores from the special ed education data. Now, what happened when that was done is that in 2009, these were the results, so we're currently in 2023. In 2009, 8% of deaf and 15% of hard of hearing reading grade level, again, 8% deaf, 15% hard of hearing, school administrators said, if hearing and speaking is important, why is it that only 15% of hard of hearing students were at reading grade level? Now, I've already answered that question. It's because the language acquisition issue hasn't been resolved. Moving on, 10% deaf were at grade level math. So deaf are better at math than literacy in those years. And then 18% hard of hearing performed at grade level math. There is no other data before or after the year 2009 on deaf students. All deaf student data is included with special ed data, and we accept it. Why do we accept that? LEAD K was put in place, and the national scope hasn't picked that up. This idea is perfect because it's based on problem solving and on implementing solutions. And all deaf people in America and agreed to work together, should agree to work together on LEAD K, and that's not something I'm seeing. We have bits and pieces happening on their own here and there, and we won't achieve success that way. Now, again, talking about SB 210, it was based on solutions, decisions made off solutions, and now in the implementation. Next slide. Now we have been able to collect new data that did not exist and that we did not have before. Before SB 210, children's language assessments, deaf children's language assessments during second grade is the data we're able to capture. My son's third grade teacher cautioned the students coming back to school. These are all hearing children. She said, if your child is not reading by the end of third grade, you should start an intervention and you should be concerned. That really stood out to me because that was a hearing teacher talking about my hearing son. And I thought, why haven't I been told that? Hearing children have interventions for literacy. I think interventions are something we should also do for deaf children. So, SB 210 mandated testing deaf babies at 6 months, in 6 month blocks, 6 months of age and moving forward. And if we can back up the slide just a bit. The current data is as of 2019. Oh, excuse me, it was published in 2020 based on data in 2019. And that shows that deaf babies age 6 months, 12 months, 18 months are reaching those milestones, right? Eye gaze, hand movement. And by the time they reach age 3, the number reduces. The measure of kindergarten readiness reduces And so now, if those measures reduce, there is an opportunity to have a conversation about switching the type of education that deaf child has. So it's important for parents to be familiar with milestones, and SB 210 requires that those milestones be shared with families so that those families can see what milestones their child should be reaching, and if they lack or haven't reached any of those milestones, that they then should be concerned. And now I want to give you a quick summary, but this is a good example. Okay, and in the Journal of WH Questions, oh, okay, excuse the interpreter. So in that journal, we were covering WH questions, and I'll go back to WH questions now. There are a lot of journal articles that have been published based on research, based on commentaries. There are different types of publications. I took one publication and I've got it verbatim here, and it's a good example of how the message about deaf children is perpetuated. And here it is on the screen. This was written in their abstract. Language development is a multifaceted, dynamic process involving the discovery of complex patterns and the refinement of native language competencies in the context of communicative interactions. This is linguistic speak. However, it's accurate. It's true. This reflects what language development is. The key word here is in communicative interactions, dialogue, back and forth in a native language. This process, I took this line out of that same journal article, and it went on to say this process is already advanced by the end of the first year of life for hearing children. But prelingually, deaf children who initially lack a language model may miss critical experiences during this early window. I want you to keep in mind that red may miss. The next line says language is essential for the human ability to think, remember, plan, and communicate. Guess who wrote this? We'll see on the next slide. You see the title? This suggests that deaf children might be missing before cochlear implantation, and it's not even may. It's they are missing. This is a semantic game that is played. So how can those people continue writing things like this and things like deaf children can learn to talk? They don't say deaf children are learning to talk. So we need to be more mindful of semantics in these types of articles as well. Moving forward. The question is asked, ASL? ASL in English? English only? Why is that debate still ongoing? Historically, since IDEA, since cochlear implants began, there's been a heavy emphasis on English, and deaf students still are not doing better. Perhaps they're doing worse. If we can really debate this question, can we? Then they would ban deaf students' data scores because we would already know what those scores would show. Moving forward. Why the decision? Why one versus the other? It's based on must be based on data on reinforcement of child's brain architecture. After studies on deaf adults shows that their brains are different than other adults who have language acquisition. So, what are we doing to change that window of opportunity from birth to 5 years of age? I don't see that happening. Must be based on data of literacy development, on social and development, emotional development, and cognitive skills. There are plenty of articles talking about uh, behavior difficulties in deaf children, talking about autism in deaf children, and it ends up being a broken record. We need to mobilize and do something to problem solve. We need to mobilize and propose a solution to this issue. That's what I ask of you. EHDI. I will admit that I'm shocked EHDI was passed in December and reauthorized. I was in a complete stupor. And I thought the deaf community didn't debate the reauthorization. My dissertation in February of 2022 was based on this, about EHDI implementation and laws. I will show you some data on what it was based on. EHDI guarantees medical and, in parentheses there, communication or language acquisition. And this is verbatim from the law, from EHDI. This language comes right out of the law. So there could be communication or language acquisition. We've accepted that. Audiological, medical, and language intervention data collection. So where is that data? When we talk about deaf children not being language ready at the kindergarten level, where is the data? There is no evaluation of the policy and implementation since its passage in 2000. There's no checks and balances to make sure the law is appropriate and effective. Again, it was passed in 2000, amended in 2010, reauthorized in 2017. It was reauthorized in December of 2022, all the way through 2026, which means we've got 3 more years. Will deaf children continue to suffer language deprivation in these years? That's the question I ask you. This is from NCHAM. They serve all 50 states and host an annual conference. They serve all the groups that you see on the slide: children and family, birthing hospital, audiologists, medical specialists, early intervention programs, policymakers, early childhood programs, state EHDI programs, advocacy and support groups. Are those advocacy and support groups deaf? Maybe, if deaf people force themselves to take on that work. But this also includes parents, audiologists. You don't see deaf as a group in those nexuses that are on that slide. Now, I can't go into depth on this, but if you're interested in policy, content analysis, in my dissertation, I do cover this. We did a policy analysis on what the law says on terminology, and then we also did a word count for hearing, language, speech, counted the time or frequency of use, and it was used 27,000 times in different websites. And you can look at my paper if you're interested in my dissertation. I go in depth on that. What I found in that word search, frequency word search, you can see that the word hearing was mentioned 535 times. It came up in policy and implementation data. Language came up 145 times. Intervention almost came up more than language. You see it at 121. But hearing came up the most. And so this shows or reflects that EHDI is focused on hearing and acquiring spoken language. So the question I'd like to ask you tonight is, how do we improve ASL and English development for deaf children? That's the question tonight. And I hope that we can really come up with some ideas for the national scale, and so that we can create a movement and change the horizon for deaf children. Let me ask the interpreter if he's okay. So, can we have a debate? Should we ask questions? Is there anyone in the audience that would like to ask questions, make a comment? Either is fine. If it's late and you're sleepy, I hope those of you that have watched my presentation are agitated enough to call me tomorrow and have a conversation where we come together to create or do something on a national level. The state is doing well, but we need to impact the nation. People on the East Coast tend to say, Californians, calm down. And that always makes me laugh. As the East Coast looks to us in surprise. But if it was your child being affected by language deprivation, you wouldn't ask anyone to slow down. This is what's happening in our lives at the moment, and we need to do something about it. And I'm asking you, audience, to share your ideas. Thank you for attending my presentation. We are moving towards a break, and I do hope that you interact, dialogue, and ask questions about tonight's presentation. Kavita speaking. Welcome back after our break. Dr. Hattrack, your presentation is timely and really made me dive into these questions that we have from the audience for you. First question says, if you saw the show last Tuesday, the show Accused, it's about a deaf woman who was a surrogate for a hearing couple. The baby she birthed them was also deaf. What are your thoughts about the show and the context of what you just explained about language, social emotional, and cognition? Marla speaking, that is an excellent question. Two things. I have a personal perspective and an advocate perspective, and sometimes they differ. On a personal level, I admit I was shocked. Shocked at how accurate the representation was. It was a realistic experience of deaf adults. It was almost like when Sarah Novak published a book, True Business. If many of you are familiar with that book, True Business. Once I read that book, that first page, my jaw dropped. Wow. She was talking about deaf topics in amazing ways. When I have a reaction, I know it means it was done right. So, of course, I was thrilled with the script in the courtroom when the surrogate mother was making her point. Now, it was a beautiful narrative. And that's a good example of deaf adults and the narratives we see on social media. We see deaf adults talking about their artwork, about how they experience life. And what do we do with that? This is Kavita So True. What do we do with those stories? What do we do with those narratives? What are we doing to change the picture of a deaf adult's experience in a hearing family? That's one question. Now, another thing. I watched the episode. It was wonderful. There are moments in the episode when they could have showed what a deaf baby's experience is like maybe the eye gaze that a deaf baby has. Deaf babies are really good with moving their eyes to take in language. They didn't show that, and at this point, right, it's my criticism. However, they could have showed that. The episode was well done, and I say this because there was a deaf director. Marlee Matlin, being deaf, knows the conversation, knows the experience, and is familiar with that. And I was very impressed with the portrayal. And I'm glad that that I was able to live in a time where I can see that. Just like I saw the movie Coda, completely captivating and shocking for me. So that was a good question. Thank you for asking. This is Kavita speaking. It's also a good start. We have a foot in the door and we're generating that exposure to the hearing world of what the deaf community is really like. This is Dr. Hattrack speaking. Oh, boy, do we have the foot in the door. It's a good start, yes. And I want to hear your comments, Kavita, but we still need to go back and address the unsolved issues that continue to perpetuate the issues, right? It's language deprivation from birth to the age 5. I just want to reiterate that part. This is Kavita. I agree with you, Dr. Marla Hattrack. That is the truth. Okay, our second question. Where can we find the language milestones for deaf children at the California Department of Education website? This is Dr. Hattrack saying it's on their website. You can search California Department of Education milestones I didn't bring a link tonight. I'm so sorry. I apologize. That would have been something I could have brought. I do want to mention that you can use any language milestone chart from Google. Deaf children should be meeting those milestones as well. So you can search any language milestone. But the one from the California Department of Education, that one is more aligned with visual communication, sign language learners. It's more like it includes classifiers, it includes facial expressions. So it's a little more visual in its milestone levels. But I do want to emphasize that deaf children can acquire the same language milestones as hearing children. That's the emphasis. This is Kavita. Yep. I hope our viewers did see that response to their question. Moving on to question number 3. Is the language milestones information a part of the Lead K movement? Dr. Hattrack asks, can you repeat that question? Sure, says Kavita. Are the language milestones information a part of the Lead K movement? Dr. Hattrack responding, good question. Now, I did mention the Lead K movement, and I also mentioned that there were about 30 deaf stakeholders from organizations around the state, California, that came together to decide on birth to 5 years of age milestones, language acquisition milestones, excuse me. In that conversation, they had another meeting led by Sherry Farina and a couple other members to really refine the writing of the legislative bill. And that was refined to 3 areas. One, that language milestones that have been development language milestones must be shared with parents. If parents have a deaf child, then early start education pamphlets must be shared with them, which means that parents are empowered by reading the data and they could see the differences and they can reach out to their school educators and say, my child isn't meeting these milestones. That also mandated that all deaf babies at the age of 6 months and every 6 months moving forward have a language assessment. And then that data must be shared back to the state. That was part of the conversation and what was included in that. I think that bill is a genius bill. This is Kavita, definitely. I have to agree. Okay, moving on to our 4th question. Speaking of legislation, what kind of bill can CAD, California Association of the Deaf, and CalEd and other organizations advocate for to support deaf children and their early language development? This is Dr. Hattrack. Are we speaking of California only? Kavita says, yeah, they are talking about the bill and mentioned legislation for CAD, for CAD and CalEd and other organizations in California, maybe advocacy organizations, on what they can advocate for deaf children's early language development. This is Dr. Hattrack. I do have my, and I'm not really sure what I would call it. I have my, okay, I think I know. If we are to mobilize and have our dialogue, I would like to see K through 12 educators, school principals, and so on become more invested and start talking with the school districts, start a conversation with the SELPAs, the special education, what's that acronym stand for? Special Education Local Planning Agency. There we go. The SELPAs, and have those conversations about them being invested within the SELPA district and get them to see and acknowledge this. Maybe work hand in hand with them. I think K through 12 educators are aware, but they think of it as a status quo. All deaf children just can't read. We can't allow them to continue with that complacent perspective And we're all human and we want to be accepting, right? And the educators are doing their job and doing good work, but there's a national scope. We want to get that level of investment, get it on the national level, and have them be concerned about language deprivation issues. Kavita asks, how about getting parents involved? This is Dr. Hatrack. I had an interesting experience. I asked deaf individuals themselves, and before I continue along that line, let me mention I know that parents should be our allies. They aren't, not yet, but they should. Parents are often unfamiliar of the issues. So, back to what I was saying. I asked deaf people that have cochlear implants and no longer use them. I was very curious, so I reached out to a couple and asked if they had a debate with their parents or a conversation with their parents about how they should have never given you a cochlear implant. And they said they have not had that conversation with their parents. I asked why, and I didn't get a response. Kavita says, how shocking. This is Dr. Hatrack. I think it's a sensitive topic, and deaf individuals don't want to hurt their parents. But if we can mobilize and have a debate and offer support and get individuals to realize the issues, maybe this can stop. Does it lead to stunted social emotional development? Potentially it could. I wish I had all the answers, and I admit I don't. However, every time something like that comes up, it does jar me, and it makes me think, wow, my family and my children tell me when I'm wrong, when I do something wrong or something bad, I just don't think about it. And other families don't have that. But it would be nice if we can have the conversation as a community and include those parents in our movement as advocates. But none of this has taken place yet or happened yet. This is Kavita Wright. I would love to see including those community members, and I would love to see the response to the why. I think it would be nice. Yeah, maybe someday in the future we will have that. Okay, moving on to the next question. Question number 5 asks, how do we help parents understand in lay language that speech or talking is not language? What framework do you use to help them get it? Dr. Hatrack says, if I knew the answer to that, I would have done it already. I don't have a magic ball and an answer. We are still powerless at the moment. I think other marginalized communities, like the gay and lesbian community or other minorities, can speak for themselves and interact with legislators for themselves. They can speak with medical professionals. They can have the debates. They can have those conversations and get others to see their point. As deaf individuals, we rely on interpreters to relay that information, which means that we need to develop a strategy. We need to work on planning, paperwork, publish articles, support each other. I don't think we support each other enough as a community. I am now realizing and seeing that we try to be everything at all times, and it's not working. It does not work. Deaf people are experts in American Sign Language and are experts in all these areas, and that's great for them, but that's just not how the world works. We need to start complementing each other's skills and gifts and coming together because we have it. We just have to put it into use. This is Kavita. I agree with you. Some people always say, well, who's going to pay for the interpreters? Who will have the time to do this? And it's exactly like what you said. We need to come up with a strategy. We need to raise funds as well. Strategy and funding go hand in hand. Moving on to the sixth question. How can we get medical professionals to work with deaf professionals like yourself? How do we get them on board to work with us? Someone like you, Dr. Hatrack. Dr. Hatrack speaking. I just finished my PhD last year, and I'm still trying to find my bearings. Congratulations, says Kavita. Oh, thank you, says Dr. Hatrack. I'm still finding my bearings, and I'm still trying to figure out a way to do this. We need to develop a speaker bureau, people who are experts in language acquisition, who can speak to that topic, experts in these areas. We need to prepare and make recommendations to medical associations and programs like that. We can start at the state level. We can start with the California Medical Association. We can start with the California Audiologist Association. We can start there. We should be able to send them a letter of introduction, introduce ourselves, but we understand we all have full-time jobs, so there are going to be limitations. But we have to strategize to share the workload amongst our community and make use of deaf people's gifts and talents that exist in the community. Like, for example, we should focus 1 year on a speaker series and speaking to medical professionals. Then a second year, we should focus on post-secondary. We need to develop a strategy, because if not, it turns into a mismatch of strategies, which is ineffective. You might get a win out of the blue, but it won't be systemic. So we need to work with an organized strategy. This is Kavita. I agree with that method of addressing this. Question number 7 says, should we encourage more deaf professionals to attend EHDI conferences? Like, for example, in March in Cincinnati, in Ohio, should we encourage more deaf professionals to attend those? Dr. Hatrack responding. Should we encourage deaf professionals to attend? Yes. It is a good investment of our time. If we have limited resources, I'm not sure. To attend those different conferences, if they present the same old status quo, same old, what impact will that have? I would rather our community be involved in letter writing to our legislators to complain about the issue. The power of letters we don't recognize. And I mean, deaf people do not realize how powerful letter writing is. Letter writing to our legislators, or letter writing to those federal agencies that fund programs. We should let them know of the issue. Let them know that EHDI does not meet our community's needs. This is Kavita. Thank you. And the reason I say that is because you see higher number of deaf attendants. That could put some pressure on these organizations. It would create a community, a pocket of community within these organizations. Dr. Marla, well, I know we should attend EHDI and so on and so on. There are so many conferences to attend. How would we do that? We need those professionals who can do it on their time. I mean, I have mixed feelings about EHDI. If you remember in the beginning, I mentioned that my family said something like, oh, yeah, but that's for hearing people. That's a hearing thing. Why would we do that? We're not going to get involved. It doesn't matter. That's their thing. Right? But that shows not being familiar, not knowing the impact of EHDI. It's hard for people like me, like myself, who should be teaching them and educating them, to just go and attend an EHDI conference. I would have to tolerate the whole time. But yeah, this is Kavita. Maybe it's time for us to speak up and not sit back. But you're right; these are difficult decisions to think about, and we have to think about how to change the structure, the system, their attitudes. Like you said, this requires a very robust and comprehensive strategy to be developed that will really be loud and shocking and grab the attention of these people. Okay, one more question from YouTube. What should I do as a regular person to advocate for this issue? What if I'm in a state that is not as supportive as California? And that is Matthew that had asked this question. Dr. Hat-Track asked, can you repeat the question? Sure. What should I do as a regular person to advocate for this issue? And what if I'm in some other state that is not as supportive as California? Again, from Matthew. Question from Matthew out there in YouTube. Dr. Hat-Track responding, that's a good question, Matthew. What I can say is allies are a critical part. And like I said before, we need to allocate responsibility. We need to allocate tasks. Kavita, you mentioned it in your response when we were having a conversation, and you also mentioned it a second ago. Funding. We need money. We could fundraise to pay for the interpreters, to pay for our lobbyists, to pay for our advocates, to pay for deaf people to lobby in DC, state, local level. We could fundraise. We could talk with friends, hearing friends. If you have those hearing friends, talk to them as well. I have a wonderful story. When I was working at a research lab in UCD, there was another PhD student, hearing person, and she went to a bar with a group of friends or something. They were at a bar, and people had asked her, what are you doing? What do you do? And she says, oh, I'm researching American Sign Language acquisition, how deaf babies process ASL. And all of them says, why don't you just tell them to get a cochlear implant? That was a response from the people with her at a bar. And she was shocked. And she shared that with me. And I realized there are tons of misinformation within the media. This misinformation spreads that cochlear implants are wonderful, and it's not the case. And I think media needs to turn around the image of cochlear implants being a wonder solution. I think there's less and less of that now, but I would imagine that definitely people think about cochlear implants. But if we had hearing allies who would help us, or if we had hearing allies and we had fundraising and we had a team of deaf individuals strategizing, that's what it would take for us to really shift the needle. Kavita says we could also reach out to other associations of the deaf in other states and get them involved. Right, says Dr. Hat-Track. We can work with other associations of the deaf, and we can work with states that have commissions of the deaf. In California, we do have DSS, a Deaf Services Association. It's a wonderful organization that represents each part of California. There are 8 areas, and we collaborate with them. There is a lot of mobilization that needs to take place. There's a lot of hard work that needs to be done to pull us together. But I have a sense that that hard work is completely worth the investment. This is Kavita. I agree. And the response from the person says, thank you so much. I love seeing from CAD. Thank you for your sweet message. We are done with our questions. I believe we are done for the night. I do have one more thing to add. Perhaps we should reach out to NAD, the National Association of the Deaf, so that we can connect to all states, because the National Association of the Deaf represents all the associations for the deaf and should work to strengthen our solidarity and our momentum as we come together to work on this issue. And those are just my thoughts, says Kavita. This is Dr. Hattrack. I'd like to respond to that, Kavita. I think it's important as we develop allies, as we come to work together and collaborate, whether it's NAD or the state, these entities need to know how to problem solve, how to develop plans, how to make decisions, how to respond with solutions. They have to have the knowledge. They have to know how to mobilize the state agencies to work together. And it's hard work, but it's not impossible. Kavita speaking, I agree. You're so correct. All a person needs to have is passion, a passion and a desire to do the work. Most state associations of the deaf are volunteer positions. So the folks that serve in those positions have a huge heart and are completely dedicating and giving of themselves completely. This is Dr. Hattrack. Yep, it takes passion, a lot of it. This is Kavita. You are correct. Dr. Hattrack, let me thank you for your fabulous presentation tonight. I'd like to thank the interpreter tonight who is voicing for you. I'd like to thank the captionist. I'd like to thank our video production behind the scenes, which you don't see. So we'll see you next month. And if you're interested in the topics that we will have and presenting then, please reach out to the organization via our email, which is 1906. And the interpreter missed the rest of it. Kavita does say thank you so much. Good night to all.